Welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly. This is your host. I've come out of hiding now because the war between Russia and Ukraine demands that I come out and add my 2 cents into this pot where everyone is sharing their opinions. But I think today's guest is definitely, he's worth the time that we will be giving you on this topic. He has a master's in European history. He is the smartest person I know, partially because he is the only person that I know who can explain the War of the Spanish Succession, which actually is incredibly relevant to what we're going on right now because it dealt with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We can get to that over the course of today's discussion. But thank you for joining me, Alan Atchison. How are you doing?
Good, great. Thanks for having me, and it's good to see you back on the air again.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to come out do a couple things on this because I was a very active anti-war activist. And I talked about this in the podcast that I did yesterday with Brittany Klein. We did, Is the Left Finally Dead? And so we spent a good hour talking about what is left of the left wing now that everything that made Barack Obama's presidency possible was rooted in the left wing's anti-war effort. And that anti-war effort was not only against war, it was against corporate collusion with the military-industrial complex. It was against ethnic demonization. It was against the restriction of civil liberties. And all of this has been destroyed by the Russia bashing, McCarthyist, warmongering left. So we talked about that. But now, to be fair, I went back and forth with my friend Michelle Schacht, who's a left, she's still a lefty. And she said, well, you got to do one on Is the Right Wing Finally Dead, just to be fair. And she brought up something interesting, which I didn't know, that the Koch brothers and Soros had some kind of meeting of the minds in 2019. If you know anything about that, that will be. Oh. But we don't have to talk about that because the bigger issue is, what is the future of the right wing in America after this Ukraine-Russia war? I'm going to start by introducing to Alan. Alan, by the way, is the editor of the Capstone Report, which has really made a lot of waves. And we talk usually about stuff that deals with the Southern Baptist Convention, but he really, his really strong expertise is in European politics and European history. So I think he's probably the best person to talk about this war between Russia and Ukraine. But I want to show you first a graphic that was presented on Quillette, by Kathy Young. I don't know if you're familiar with Kathy Young. She is a right-wing, but sort of middle-of-the-road right-wing libertarian. And she wrote this scathing piece called Ukraine and the Pro-Putin Right, where she expressed her massive frustration with all of these conservative thinkers who she says are pro-Putin. Now, probably that is a bit of a stretch. I think a lot of these are people who are questioning whether the United States should so aggressively side with Ukraine in this conflict. Some of them are saying we shouldn't demonize Putin and the Russian side right now because there is a story on their side, and that story has some logical basis. But if you look at some of those people that she has just in the graphic, she's basically taking on Pedro Gonzalez, Richard Hanania, Jesse Kelly, a lot of people. There are, and to the credit of the right wing, there are a lot of people on the right wing this time around who are not buying the warmongering rhetoric. So when we talked about is the left dead, we had to deal with, where is the left's critique of the warmongering? That was a difficult thing. For the right wing, it's a little bit different because I feel as though a majority of people on the right wing are skeptics about this war. I think that there is a sizable minority of them. I'm not going to say that they're pro-Putin, but they see Putin's point and they don't want to jump to saying that he's the supervillain in this. They kind of have an equal scales approach to it. So that is interesting, but that now the right wing is going to be the home of the anti-war movement. I'm delighted because I was always stuck with nowhere to land because I was conservative on the social issues, being a Christian, and I was anti-war. Now I'm totally at home on the right wing. Thank you very much, Pedro Gonzalez. But where does this leave the right wing, considering that we still have a very large portion of the right wing that sounds like Kathy Young, that the people writing for the National Review, we still have the David Frenches and the Russell Moores and all of these sort of quasi proto pseudo conservatives who it seems have emerged now with a new place to land in the conservative sphere, because now they're going at the Achilles heel of the right wing, which is warmongering. The right wing loves war. They love patriotism. They love calling people un-American. And so, what's your first hot take on it, Alan? I mean, is this going to really split the right to the point that it's a massive realignment, like something we haven't seen for a good couple decades?
It's very possible that we are going to see a split in the right. We're seeing it already as conservatives are sort of pulling away from uh, more libertarian wing, sort of like David French. They're reconsidering some of the ideas about what does free speech really mean. Should we allow a teacher in a school to promote critical race theory? The David French libertarian people would say, yes, of course. And so foreign policy is naturally going to become part of this discussion. And for the first time in my memory, we're seeing conservatives reject this sort of Wilsonian idealism that George W. Bush came out with. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. We're going to spread it by the bayonet. And they're beginning to say, whoa, we need to do what's in the national interest. So war or anything else like that has to really be weighed against the price. And is it going to be worth it in the cost of blood and treasure? And does it actually do something for either the ideals of the United States or the geopolitical? Does it strengthen the United States geopolitically? So now you're seeing a whole group of people saying we want to follow policies that make America stronger. We're no longer a hegemon that we can spend as much money as we want, or we can invade wherever we want. There are constraints. China is very strong. In fact, it is the key threat to American safety and security for the next century. So why are we messing around in a European type of battlefield? Yeah, we have interest in Europe, but it is a secondary theater compared to Asia right now. So a lot of people are stepping back and saying, well, we need to, sure, we want to stop Putin from running over a democracy or any country in Europe, but they don't necessarily want to escalate this to the point that we're going to see an intervention. And the reality is, a lot of people are also finally realizing that when you have nuclear armed powers, whoever's willing to run the biggest risk is going to win the confrontation. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was far more willing to run a risk than Khrushchev because the missiles in Cuba are right here. America is far more interested in what happens 90 miles offshore than Moscow. In this case, Ukraine is right there. Right within missile range, short missile range, I think, of Moscow. So Putin's arguments about spreading NATO closer to the Russian borders, it's accurate in one sense. It really does sort of change Russia's posture if Ukraine ever were admitted to NATO and there ever were advanced weapon systems placed there. It would certainly change the dynamic of deterrence for Russia's nuclear forces. So there are a lot of things here, and sometimes I think diplomacy requires us to say these are our key interests and non-negotiables, but the other side has those too, and you've got to find a way to make a deal. So conservatives are now saying, let's take a pause and not needlessly escalate this confrontation. I think that's a healthy thing.
Well, at least the conservatives that are accessible to us on social media, definitely that is the general thrust I am seeing everywhere. The conservatives that exist in that tier of discourse, they're not the people who have really well-heeled positions in think tanks. They're not the university professors. They're not the people in Congress, but they're the people who really are very close to the grassroots, have a history of being able to mobilize because the Trump movement showed us that history, and that is their voice. They are not buying this war. We can talk about all of the reasons why this is so different from 2002 and why conservatives are having that reaction. But you are still seeing in Congress with the Republican Party, and you're seeing with the entrenched conservative elites, I mean, to the extent that they are even existing anywhere, they are warmongering. They
Well,
are absolutely in lockstep with the left. They seem to really want escalation, and I'm frankly confused as to why they want escalation. Why do you have so many Republican senators signing letters saying that, or criticizing Joe Biden because he's not tough enough, as if the answer to this is for us to get entangled in that alliance? And the NATO issue is so important to understand in all of its complexity, because when you are in a treaty organization like NATO and you bring a new member state in, remember that that's not just a question of what that member state gets from joining. It's also, we are now yoked to that government. Okay. And the Ukrainian government that exists there right now, it's only 8 years old. It was the product of a coup. The coup is controversial. There are a lot of people who would say that that was not a legitimate installation of a government because they overthrew a democratically elected government, and the color revolution was creepy, right? So now, if they're in a treaty organization like NATO, we're bound to have to deal with their drama. If they get themselves into trouble, we have to come out of there. And that's why the vetting process is so important, not just from Russia's perspective, but from our perspective. Do we really want to be chained to a government that is making these kinds of decisions and is very, possibly getting involved in adventures that we can't totally get behind? Okay. So all of that's really complex, but I guess the part that is perplexing to me is why you have at least the entrenched conservative, the people who are most able to have a platform, the people who are going to be given a speaking engagement on Fox News, or the people who would be asked to speak at one of the Christian colleges to deliver a speech. Those people are all warmongering. Am I wrong? Or is it, it seems as though they're all, ready to send fighter jets. Maybe they'll give it a veneer of us not being warmongering because we're only giving the jets to Poland, and then Poland will go kick it down the road to the Ukrainian fighters. But it seems as though they are warmongering. Where is that coming from? Why is that class so lockstep with the left?
well, there is a problem that you mentioned very early on. It's the elite problem. It's the people like Kinzinger who wants a no-fly zone,
Right.
despite the fact that it's idiotic. And that's me being polite about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Right.
a no-fly zone means you're attacking Russian troops
Mm-hmm.
or anti-air batteries in
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine, Russian air assets over Ukraine, and to make that work, Russian air defenses within the borders of Russia. So you're confronting with action and U.S. forces and NATO forces another nuclear power. It doesn't mean that it necessarily goes nuclear, but it certainly raises the stakes.
Right. Yeah.
And when you have nutcases like Lindsey Graham setting up there, somebody needs to shoot Putin or we need to depose him. Well,
Right.
then you take Putin sits over here and he has in his mind the memories of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi. What
Mm-hmm.
happened to both of those? Well, they both are dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so you change a brush fire war that is not important in the grand scheme of global security into an existential crisis, the very existence of the Russian regime. And Putin may or may not feel this way, but why take the risk? If he is going to think of that his future is Russia's future. I mean, a lot of autocrats are that way. They
Right.
personalize everything. So
Mm-hmm.
if you make it where his survival, you really change the calculus about what it's going to take to get you into a nuclear exchange. And
Right.
that's just bizarre. These are people who are not qualified to do anything. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure why we have put them in Congress for so long, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the elite problem. It's time to realize that people like Mitt Romney, who voted against removing the mask mandate, these aren't real conservatives. They're oligarchs. They're conservative in a few ways and check a few boxes. They only want power, and they're only
Hmm.
really pursuing this kind of globalist agenda. We're at a crisis point here. And I think that's why so many people on the right are forsaking these types of neoconservative policies. It's not that the conservatives might totally always reject a foreign war. It's just they want to see that it's in the national interest, and
Hmm.
that was really, I think, the heart of Donald Trump's "Make America Great Again."
Right.
People want the government's first response to an issue to be, let's do something for America and make sure our policies are making things better or at least safer for the
Hmm.
citizens.
Yeah, and I think also one of the key factors here is that 20 years ago, when there was the rush to war, 9/11 happened. Obviously, that was a huge thing that brought everything home. So it's kind of hard to compare things, but to the extent that we can compare 2002 to 2022, when George W. Bush threw all this red meat to the conservatives in America and said, if you're patriotic, if you love your country, if you're a good conservative, you're going to support what we tell you. You're going to believe what we say about the vials of anthrax and the radiological weapons. And you're going to believe everything we tell you, and you're going to wave your flag, and you're going to sign up, and you're going to go, and you're going to like it, right? When George Bush gave that message, I think that he was speaking to a conservative audience that was very ripe to hear that. We had not had a really seriously bruising military engagement since 30 years prior, during the Vietnam War. Now it's different. I mean, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan. That is the longest war. And I do think that the conservative base in America, really bore a disproportionate brunt of the stress of that, because we largely were the ones who went and signed up. I signed up for the military during the war on terror. A lot of us, we were susceptible to that messaging. We did it. We went, we signed up to serve. And then once we got there, we saw how corrupt the military is. We saw all the wasteful spending. We saw the way that troops were treated on the battlefield. And then when they came home as veterans, how they were treated. So I just think that the audience, the conservative base, that would be the logical audience for any of these conservative thought leaders right now, it's a very different base. It's a base that is tired. It's a base that's very suspicious of people who claim to be conservative and are not. I mean, that was a major part of Trump's appeal to the conservative base, is that he was addressing the fact, he was talking about the elephant in the room, which is that conservatives in America, they know that many people have used the label of conservative and they didn't live up to it, and they abused us and they took advantage of us, and we bore the brunt of it. And then at the end, when it all was counted and the smoke cleared, then what we were told was that we should really be happy that we have the economic freedom to not have health insurance. And that was all we got from that entire adventure. So I think it's a different landscape, and so it doesn't surprise me. I think that one of the things that I've realized in looking at this is, on the left, they had such a rich tradition of intellectuals who were skeptical of state authority, who were skeptical of capitalism, skeptical of the military industrial complex. All of these professors and thinkers and writers, I'm thinking of Roland Barthes, who wrote the book Mythologies back in the 1950s, really deconstructing propaganda. And that's a lot of what Foucault was trying to do. They were trying to deconstruct propaganda and to understand it. And yet, all of these professors and all of these writers, they did not communicate this to the liberal base in America, because the liberal base in America right now, they're not deconstructing the propaganda. You know how there's this debate about deconstruction in the Southern Baptist world between Kristen Dumez and, why are we even talking? The liberals are not deconstructing anything. They're just being spoon-fed propaganda, and they're falling for it. On the right wing, it's quite different, because we didn't have that huge intelligentsia. We didn't go into libraries and have entire bookshelves devoted to conservative thinkers who are reflecting our point of view. So the intellectual work was done at that mid-level range. It was done just a few feet above the grassroots. And I think that works in our favor because I think that now you have a conservative thought class, which is not highly paid, not tied to all these institutions, not really hooked into power. And they have the freedom because let's face it, if I post this on gatekeepers, the stakes for me are low, right? So I can speak freely. Does that make sense? So I think we're watching a very different kind of political class emerge. What do you think?
Well, there's no doubt about it. We are seeing the end of conservatives simply trusting every elite think tank that's out there. Just they're a lot more skeptical, and I think that happened some in some ways during the Trump administration, but I think even more so now because people are beginning to realize we're not seeing value from Washington. The policies that Republicans in Congress deliver are not that different from, say, the policies that we get from Democrats in Congress. So it's urging and pushing voters more and more to look for uh, new faces, outsiders. So I think there is a great hope there that we can finally get some accountability in the Republican Party, and then perhaps get some things accomplished. Because look at Trump controlled Congress, or Republicans controlled Congress during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. They didn't repeal Obamacare, and they didn't do a lot of things in that first phase where they had the chance. Why? And that's the problem with the Republican Party.
Yeah, and the part of it also is I think the role of the social issues, and we were talking about this off the air earlier on, is really important here. And this is where Trump, I don't think that he fully grasped the importance of the social issues either. I mean, he was very pro LGBT. Let's face it. I don't think that we made a lot of progress there. He appointed Betsy DeVos, and all of the problems we're talking about with the schools right now, that all got worse under him. So I'm not going to pretend that he was great on the social issues. But I think that the social issues are really important in what we're watching unfold right now, because ultimately, once you had Obama in power, and Obama was basically created by the anti-war left. I mean, the only reason that he was able to succeed beyond Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden in those 2008 Democratic primaries was because Biden and Clinton had voted for the Iraq war. And that, more than anything else, loomed over them. Obama supposedly, we don't have records of it, but he gave a speech supposedly opposing the Iraq war, and he wasn't in Congress when the vote was taken. So he had the image of having been the anti-war candidate. So he came into office, and that is what made the left that we see today. Was the anti-war movement. But the Democratic Party very quickly betrayed all of those anti-war and pro-worker policies, and they threw all of their weight into identity politics and to the social issues. So everything about Obama was about pro-LGBT. It was about pro-abortion. It was all of the hot trigger issues that are social issues. So people like me, I was left with the case where I kind of am naturally a Democrat. I want to be on the side of the workers. I'm definitely an anti-war type of person. I like unions, stuff like that. But the Democrats weren't going to deliver on any of that. So the only difference that I saw between the two parties was the social issues. And I think that the Republican elite, I don't know why this just didn't sink in. They thought that what all the people wanted to go to the Republican Party for was their economic policies, which don't, let's face it, they don't live up to their own economic free market principles anyway. But even if they did, that's not going to appeal to large groups of people. Oh, you don't have health insurance. There's no minimum wage. You know what I mean? You should be happy that you're economically free. Obviously, it was the social issues, I think, that kept people roped in. And that's an important factor now that Russia comes into clear focus, because from what I have been able to observe, that is a big driver of the standoff between Russia and Ukraine. When Ukraine wants to get into the EU and they want to get into NATO, okay, the EU and NATO they militantly promote these social engineering projects. They militantly, I mean, Hungary and Poland are always struggling with the EU over their LGBT policies, but the EU is going to keep on wearing them down, and they're always threatening to put sanctions, remember, against Poland and Hungary for their policies. And NATO, of course, I mean, their most recent military foray was in North Africa, where they just bombed the living daylights out of Libya. And so for Putin, when NATO and the EU are going to be right up against his border, they're going to be pushing those social issues. And they're very important in that Eastern European context, because these are people who survived the Soviet Union. They can remember a time when there was a communist regime that tried to redefine the family, make everything communal. They tried to separate the importance of motherhood and fatherhood. When you're talking about adoption, gay adoption, and sperm banking and surrogacy and all these different things, those things have a historical discomfort level in Eastern Europe that people have to understand. If you don't understand the blonde-haired babies that were forcibly adopted out by the Germans and placed with other families, so it's not such a simple thing to say, okay, Dave Rubin is a gay man and he wants a baby, so we'll just have gay adoption schemes. Putin stood very strongly on that, and that was a big reason why I went through a period of 2014, 2015, 2016, where I was branded online as being guilty of human rights violations. And I had never had any work with Russia. I'd never been to Russia, but because Russia was the boogeyman at that time, if you remember, because they ended the adoptions over the gay adoption issue, and because Russia had passed that law saying you couldn't promote homosexuality to minors in schools, right? So he was clear and he was consistent. And I think that those social matters matter, because we're seeing now that when you redefine those things, you're opening up Pandora's box, and people feel it on a personal level. When you have your daughter coming home from school saying she wants to become a boy, and she wants someone to cut off her breasts, and she wants to take hormone replacement therapy, etc., that is disruptive, it's invasive. And I think that Putin really, he seems to be the major bulwark against those things. I think that's why Kathy Young is getting the feeling like there are people who are pro-Putin, because I think that there are a lot of conservatives who were drawn in by the social issues, who did see Putin as someone who was standing up to that. Now, that's not to say that I personally don't justify invading another country and bombing it, but I just think that it's another side of the story. And I think that if the conservative movement is going to come out of this intact, I think the realignment is really going to be hinging on the social issues. I don't know what you think, but I mean, where is all this going to end up? Because it seems like among conservatives in the United States, it's clear that most conservatives want a traditional family structure to be validated. They want churches to stay true to the Bible. They want traditional gender roles to a certain degree. They want life protected. They want religious liberty. But the conservative leadership in the United States has constantly tried to get away from those issues. I mean, how do you think that that's going to end up now that we're in this clash of civilizations between Putin and between the Ukraine, which seems eager to jump in with the EU and NATO, the forces for that social redesign,
Well, there certainly is an emphasis on the right where they want people left free to recognize nature,
Mm-hmm.
that there really are biological differences and that these matter, and that the government can't pretend it doesn't exist and in fact make you say at the force of law that a boy can be a girl. So that is a huge issue. But I think it's just a tactic on the part of more liberal, more progressive types to label anyone who holds these views as being pro-Putin or whatever. I mean, it's like Orban a few months ago. He was the boogeyman. He's the bad guy. He's an authoritarian. He's, last I heard, he was running for re-election, and it's going to be a close race. It doesn't sound like a dictatorship to me if he goes to the ballot box and has to face the wrath or the applause of the voters. So I think that there is a huge emphasis finally on these social issues because they matter. And they matter in ways that I think people didn't realize for a long time. They thought, well, if I, can earn six figures, everything's going to be okay. Well, after 25, 30 years of that, from the Clinton years, the Bush years, the Obama years, to present, we're kind of paying the price for that sort of reckless uh, economic focus. We've run up our national debt. We've made ourselves weaker. Now we're dealing with this inflation problem. And that's one of the reasons that concerns me, that we are facing this pending inflationary nightmare, not sure where it stops. This is the type of thing that weakens trust in our institutions. It weakens the social cohesion. When people are suffering, and they're going to start suffering more and more as every price in food commodities continue to go up. The UN and other people are warning of food shortages coming forward. So we're going to begin seeing, even here in America, the cost of the policies we pursued for so long. And we no longer are really a nation. The identity politics has truly balkanized us. And that's I think one of the reasons conservatives are wanting something new, a new approach, is that they're people are beginning to perceive all of these types of things coming together. And I, COVID, I think, is just one element of the fraying of all trust in what the government and our bureaucracies tell us. And where this stops, I'm not really sure, because now we're rushing. We have the elites, the media, and others in government kind of pushing us closer and closer to a war in Europe, or escalation of that war,
Right.
while I don't think the people are really there yet. Although I read there was an article this morning that said already a third of Americans are in favor of greater involvement in the war in Ukraine, even if it risks nuclear war. And
Mhm.
I'm just it's stunning to hear this now, because
Right.
when Americans, these are must be Americans who didn't live through the scares of the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile
Mhm.
Crisis, the 70s, and then finally the 80s. I mean, there are too many people that don't understand that there are the world is really dangerous, and if you keep poking the bear, sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think the median age right now in the United States is 32. So half of the country was born after the Soviet Union had disappeared. I mean, more than half of the country has no memory of that time that I remember, because I'm 51. So I remember a period when it was real. I'm not going to say we had drills where we got under the desk. I've seen those from the 50s, but we didn't have that. But I remember there was a bomb shelter. There was a nuclear bomb shelter in our school, and I remember in the 1980s they had a movie called The Day After about
Yeah.
the nuclear war and the nuclear fallout, and the entire school day, the day after that aired on TV, we talked about how we felt about nuclear war. I think that this generation just they don't understand the risks of that. And they also, I think that we're seeing the breakdown in education. And now we're seeing the fruits of that. The fact that history was replaced by social studies, I'm just
Hmm.
struck by how little of a historical grasp all these people have, and what happened to the liberals who ran the educational establishment. They were the ones who were supposed to be educating people so that they would be skeptical, so that they wouldn't become propagandized and they wouldn't become, drones for the government. But they failed. People, they don't understand. They even recent history, they just don't have an ability to analyze it. They don't understand what happened when the Soviet Union was a country. They don't have a concept of what the policies of the Soviet government were. They moved Russians all over the place because they tried to create a non-ethnic identity for the country, which sounds a lot of the creepy parallels to here in the United States. It's interesting because when I'm thinking about the conservatives' new focus on education, which I'm so happy about, because as an educator for so long, I was wondering, when are conservatives going to realize what's going on in the schools and not just tell everyone to homeschool, because not everyone can do that. Um, but it struck me as I was preparing to talk to you that I think conservatives gave liberals a chance on some things, and we got burned. And so now it's kind of like that deal's off the table. So the whole idea that we should have free speech and we shouldn't censor people, I think conservatives gave that a chance. And what they found was that liberals would censor us all the time. So now they don't, conservatives are like, yeah, I'm going to push for a law that says you can't say the word gay in kindergarten. I'm going to do it. And if we get enough votes, that law's going to pass because I gave you a chance, and you banned all kinds of words and things that I can't say. So tough luck. And then I think a lot of conservatives feel like we gave liberals a chance on the live and let live. Gay people just want to love each other and visit each other in the hospital. We did all that, and it just encroached and encroached until people on the left feel like they have a right to talk to our kids when we're not there about sex, and then to not tell us what they're. I mean, so I think that's part of it is, conservatives are burned. They feel burned. And whatever emerges of the right coming out of it is going to incorporate that. Is that still the conservative wing? I mean, is that still conservatism, what is going to emerge from this populist energy? If it's a group of people who are skeptical about war, skeptical about obedience to government, not necessarily dedicated to using the constitutional freedoms as the template for all social interactions, right? Because they're saying, yes, sometimes we need to censor things. Sometimes we need to fire people for saying things that are inappropriate. Is that conservatism, or is
I
the
think
right basically dead? You know what
Well,
I mean?
I think it can be conservatism in some ways. For
Yeah.
example, there are a lot of historical people who were conservative who were very skeptical of war. I always go back to Bismarck, someone who was not afraid to go to war, but prior to World War One, he constantly warned that what was going to happen in the Baltic or the Balkans was not worth the blood of one or the bones of one Pomeranian grenadier. So there is always a strand of conservatism that can be very reluctant to go to war. I think it's almost the default position because conservatives know war brings change. You wouldn't have gotten the revolution in 1917, and Stalin and Lenin both admitted this, without the disruption of World War I, without the total collapse of the regime and society caused by the war. So I think understanding as a conservative, you want to preserve the things that are good in society. And we think private property and we think all of these types of things and lives are good. We should want to preserve them and only risk that when there is something also equally good or better that's at stake. So I do think a lot of this is going to be good for conservatives. And I think it's time that conservatives learned to use some elements of the power of the state. There's always the fear that David French is, well, they're going to do that to you if you do it to them. Well, they already are.
Yeah, we've already
They're,
that's I think David French, his arguments, it's like it's no one listens to them anymore because we've already heard this. We've already heard that we should let other people speak and we shouldn't try to no platform. We've already heard this. And and David French, I know he was president of FIRE at one point, but he wasn't riding in with the cavalry to defend those of us who got canceled. He kind of justified a lot of the cancellations of people. So I just don't think those arguments are valid anymore. You know, uh,
I think it's good that people are finally saying, hold on, I'm not
mhm,
so sure this is right. I want to protect my family, my kids from ideological and now sexual indoctrination. It's okay to say, whoa, I want things that reflect what I believe taught to my kids. And when you can get a majority in a state and vote against certain things like sexual indoctrination to kindergartners or
mhm.
critical race theory being promoted and taught in schools, those are really good things. And also, you brought up a good point. Education is a disaster in America right now, lower levels all the way through higher ed. I mean, one of the things that's annoyed me so much is the constant Munich analogies that we're
Oh, it's
hearing all the
terrible.
time.
All right, yeah, let's talk about let's okay, so we both kind of agree that the right's not dead, but it's on, it's going through its little cocoon thing. It's in its chrysalis stage. We'll see what comes up. So let's not talk about history. Like, um, what the heck is this Russian involvement in Ukraine? One of the things that I find interesting is that old adage that the cover up is worse than the crime. Okay. And it seems to me like one of the things that the Biden administration did that really messed up was that when the problem broke out in the Ukraine, they were in CYA mode and they denied things that then it turned out were true. And I don't know whether they can recover from that credibility gap now. They said that there were no biolabs, and then that's looking like their story is breaking down. I'm not going to endorse the full on, you know, sort of morbid interpretation of it that the United States was developing a plan to, like, release the plague in Russia in those biolabs in Ukraine. But they were clearly biodefense labs that were funded by the Defense Department. And you don't get funding from the Defense Department, if it's not somehow dealing with weaponized pathogens. So that story broke down. They were saying that Putin's story about the denazification was just nonsense because there was no real neo-Nazi movement in Ukraine. And then that denial by the United States broke down because people just did basic internet searches on what the Guardian had run and the Atlantic Monthly and all these different Salon, all these different magazines had been covering for a decade the links between really dangerous white nationalist groups in Ukraine and that current anti-Russian government that's there. So, that broke down. They tried to hide just even the recent history that Biden voted to invade Iraq and he's the president now. So that kind of undermines his moral witness. And they didn't want people to know about the campaigns of the Ukrainian government in the Russian majority areas of the Ukraine. They had been involved in some pretty violent stuff. Even the fact that it was a coup that brought that government to power and the CIA was so heavily involved in that, it just seems as though I don't know whether the United States can recover the stain of just having been caught out there with lie after lie, because in this wartime environment with so many accusations flying back and forth, if people don't trust your word, then a lot of accusations that aren't true are going to stick. I'm trying to, like, for instance, when I think of someone like Napoleon, who, he was a master at propaganda, and he managed to get so many people to fight for him because he would say that he was overturning the old monarchic order and he was going to liberate the people, right? That was his shtick. But then as the years went on, by the time he invades Spain, he kind of imposes his weird French government on Spain, and he doesn't deliver his promises, that people start to not take his word as seriously. It starts to break down. What do you think?
Well, I think there is a credibility gap in some ways.
Yeah.
But what worries me is that people are so invested in their partisan opinions, in
Yeah.
their partisan side, that it doesn't really matter. Did Republicans really get that concerned that they didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in the quantities that they were led to believe? Not really. I mean, they give him a pass. It's George W. Bush. He meant well. Well, that's what's going to happen here. The Democrats and their voters are just going to continue giving a pass. So it's about 40% of the country on both sides that really don't care. If their guy does it, they're just going to shrug and give up.
Mm-hmm.
And just vote the same way next time.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that also the media does such a good job of drumming up war fever, the hysteria, based on, oh, here's a picture of a wounded child, or here's a
Right.
picture of
Yeah.
this. And I mean, it's so easy to manipulate a culture that is so highly emotional. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's there. I'm reading articles and reading things, and it's just it's almost like teenagers going through this angst.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really worrying that so many of these people who are saying these things and writing these things are so close to the levers of power. They don't seem to pay attention to the lessons of history. I mean, and they want to say Putin does not have any real interest in Ukraine, which I think, look, we're not faced with the same type of like analogies. They want to use Munich, but flipping
Right.
it for a second, does anyone think that the US would sit silently while, say, Mexico became a satellite of China?
Actually,
I
we have a great example because that happened. You know, in we annexed most of Mexico instead of trying to deal with whether they were going to become allies of England or
yeah,
France or countries that we had tense relationships
well,
with. We just annexed them. I mean, we
well,
literally moved. You know,
the
yeah,
annexation of Texas was actually one of the justifications was specifically to prevent the
right.
Republic of Texas becoming an ally or a colony, a colony of either France or England, and that was a concern that even early in the days of the
Yeah,
Republic,
I
they
mean, it's
saw the geopolitical
yeah,
realities,
yeah.
and that goes back to Ukraine. It could be that there's real motivations on the part of Putin. It wouldn't be surprising, given that Russian history has examples of this. I
Hmm.
mean, Stalin tried to negotiate with Finland in the late 1930s because Finland's territory was right against Leningrad. It was
Right.
within 20 or
Hmm.
30 miles. The artillery shells in that era, they could drop artillery shells on Leningrad from Finland. So he wanted a buffer zone, and he offered to trade 1,000 square miles that he wanted from Finland, and he'd give him 2,000 somewhere else. But he wanted to increase that buffer, and because he worried that Britain or Hitler would put their armies in Finland and have an easy attack on Leningrad, which was the key arms center,
Right.
large industrial center. So when diplomacy and negotiation failed, Stalin invaded and got ultimately, eventually, after a bloody war, sort of what he wanted. I see a lot of parallels in that to this. It's not, of course, any analogy or whatever, it's not exactly the same. But if Putin is worried about the placing of weapon systems in
Hmm.
the future in the Ukraine, it does make sense that he might want to have some guarantees that that's not going to happen. And a government in Ukraine that is actually uh, more respectful of Russia's geopolitical interest. I mean, there are a lot of people who have been yelling that the model of Austria in the Cold War or perhaps Finland in the Cold War should have happened. A Finlandization where they have their liberty, their independence, but they understand and are respectful of Russia's
Right.
or the Soviet Union then's geopolitical problems. There's an unwillingness, I think, to consider the realities that sometimes the other side has rational demands. They may not be fair, they may not be right, but they
Right.
may have things that are fully rational based on their security requirements.
Yeah, and
And
I
finding a
don't.
way to I was going to say, finding a way to accommodate that so innocent people
Mhm.
living on the periphery of these societies aren't killed seems to be the point of diplomacy. And I think that's where the U.S. failed. I think the West has encouraged Ukraine to not negotiate in good faith. And sending more arms there is going to guarantee the struggle continues. Now, that might be good to humiliate Putin and raise the cost, and that has its own advantage, but it's innocent Ukrainians that are going to pay the price, the civilians that do pay the price in every battle and war. And I'm not sure humiliating Putin is really a good justification for that at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I, you know, people are going to reject what we're saying as whataboutism. You know that's what everyone. But you know, I'm going to put that allegation to the side about we're engaging in whataboutism. I think that whenever you have an event like this, all the different countries that are involved, they're real countries led by individuals who have a real personal history, and so you can't just all of a sudden become an abstraction in the middle of the debate. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
NATO bombed the living daylights out of Libya. They killed a lot of civilians. That's the same organization that Ukraine is saying they want to join and have a military alliance treaty with right up on the border of Russia. This is not whataboutism. It's like that is who NATO is. That's what Putin is dealing with. It's not an abstraction for him, and so it is rational. I thought that as a demand was a reasonable demand. I mean, I remember the footage of NATO bombing Libya and stuff. And if I'm Russia, yeah, I don't want those people right up on the border there, especially with all of the heated rhetoric against Putin on the LGBT issue that has been coming out of all of the Western European countries. I think that makes sense. And then, the United States, it's like we can't just ignore our own history. James Monroe was the president when there were a wave of revolutions that liberated most of Latin America. And James Monroe came up with a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said that the United States would interfere if any of those republics formed alliances that were not beneficial to the United States. And we invaded pretty much every country in Latin America at some point. We annexed half of Mexico, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we blockaded them, we invaded the Dominican Republic. We tried to invade Cuba. We invaded the Dominican Republic. We funded all of these military rebels in Central America. We took the Panama Canal. We funded coups in Brazil and Argentina and Chile. I mean, that's the history that led to us being in this very strong geographic position. So it is, I do think that the history is worth studying. I'm worried that people in America, they got social studies, they didn't get history. They got courses in human geography. They don't even understand what the Monroe Doctrine is. I don't think most of them don't know who Simon Bolivar was. They don't understand that whole history of the Latin American revolutions. A lot of people in Texas, they don't even understand that Mexico freed the slaves and then Texas broke away and reimposed slavery on people who were already free. I mean, they don't know that history. And so I think it is important to keep that in mind. Now, regarding the Ukraine, here's something that really just kind of sticks in my mind, and this stuff better than anyone I know. So the Ukraine now, it seems to be racing into having these alliances with Poland and, kind of with Austria and these people in Eastern Europe and Germany. Is that smart on the Ukraine's part, given the fact that all of those are places that also invaded the Ukraine? I mean, they also have a history of, betraying them and invading them and colonizing. I mean, Germany certainly invaded them. Poland invaded them, didn't they? I mean, didn't the Austro-Hungarian Empire also take major chunks of the Ukraine? So are they is that not relevant, or does it seem like the leadership of Ukraine is kind of making the same mistake, that they made before? What do you think?
Well, I will say this in Ukraine's defense. I'd rather be friends with Poland or even Germany than Putin. So in just you're going to probably have a better friend over here than
Yeah.
over in Moscow. And that's just the reality. So
Yeah.
if I'm wanting to particularly create a system that is safer, that would definitely be what I would want to do and the policy I would want to pursue.
Okay. Now, do you see this very interesting individual who just joined us? That is Ray Fava. Hello, greetings, Ray Fava.
Greetings.
He works at the evangelical dark web. Ray, this is Alan Atchison. Do you know who Alan Atchison is?
Yes, Capstone Report.
Yeah, Capstone Report. So he's really good at European history. So we were talking about some of the history. We want to bring you in on that discussion, but first we have to ask you just a real quick hot take question. Do you think the right wing is basically going to be dead after this Ukraine-Russia discussion, or are these world events basically going to destroy what was the American right wing? What do you think?
I don't really think that's the case, but I do think the American right wing will go more isolationist. I think the neocons are completely outing themselves, and I don't think there's a future for neoconservatism.
Right.
So I think we're in a pickle here because you got a bunch of people that realize that Ukraine is just a puppet for the globalists who are actually our enemies. And Russia's just kind of acting in their own national self-interest.
Yeah.
So you can, they're playing the game of
Mhm.
geopolitics, and they're doing it relatively well. And obviously that threatens the America's perceived dominance. But at the same time, our response to this, you know, we're basically creating a critical mass of countries that are going to reject the US dollar, and that's going to screw us
Yeah,
way more
yeah.
than it's going to screw the Russians.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I think that's also sort of, they're fighting the last war, which is the United States. I don't think that it's really registering with them that we are not in such a strong position to just write off India. My favorite was when people were like, let's have sanctions against India because India is refusing to honor the sanctions against Russia. And I'm like, this is not 1945 where they're like, a colony and they're powerless. They have a massive military, and they hold a
They
lot
also
of.
have a population that relies on Russian grain.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind
We're
of
supposed
like,
to starve those people.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's crazy. Well, what I was talking about with Alan is, Ukraine has a history, and I want to say that I have noticed just on social media that conservatives actually seem to bring a lot more historical knowledge to the discussion, and that's just really exciting. That you're seeing a lot of people who aren't, university professors. They're not New York Times bestseller writers. They're just regular conservatives who have educated themselves by reading books and going to the library, and they have all these great blogs about this. And so one of the things I was talking about was, Ukraine has this history where they were colonized by Poland, they were colonized by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All these different countries that now they're running to ally to get help from against Russia. I'm just wondering whether that might be a hasty miscalculation on the part of the Ukrainians, because are those countries really going to welcome the Ukraine as a long-term ally, given the groups of people who are running Ukraine and all of the ideological baggage that that's going to bring with them? I mean, that's kind of like what I was talking to Alan about. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's definitely some thoughts. First of all, Ukraine in American politics basically functions as a money laundering piggy bank for Democrats and their children. So,
Yeah.
why exactly are they our allies?
Well, because they have so much dirt on us that they could
Yeah.
destroy the reputations of half of Congress
Oh
if they're.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
me just playing the smallest violin for them. But it's like,
Yeah,
if you look at the history before that, they were like one of the countries that sold nuclear secrets to North Korea. Like, this is not a country that has a
yeah,
history of being
yeah,
friendly with the United States. I don't understand the amity displayed towards Ukraine as a country. Yeah, again, the
yeah.
Ukrainian people is a completely different story. I mean, they're under the psyop too, because
Mhm.
they'd had a TV show. Zelensky was a TV actor, and his show is about being president after calling out the corruption in Ukraine. And then they ran that same playbook, but in real life, in I believe it was 2019. So they
Right.
psyop the
Yeah,
entire population to
yeah,
accept Zelensky.
yeah. Well, I mean, I guess one of the questions is, like for instance, for them to be rushing to Germany to be a long-term ally, knowing that the neo-Nazi elements in the Ukraine, I mean, they have a lot of influence in the
The
government.
Azov Battalion, I believe it
Yeah,
is, or
yeah,
Avaz. Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
it's huge.
I mean, I'm just trying to think like if they were to be able to come out of this and out of the war and then have Ukraine, I don't think that they could stay buddy buddy with Germany and Poland long term with those people running the government. Maybe I'm wrong. I mean, but just historically, it would seem to me like that's going to be one of those hasty bedfellows that doesn't work out over the long term. But that's a lot of Ukraine's history, right? They jump from one a lot. They switch sides a lot to save themselves. You
Well, I don't
know?
know how much of a history Ukraine has as a nation. As a people, certainly more, but as a
Yeah,
nation, like,
yeah,
doesn't really have a history as one. But I mean, I think it's a little bit moot to be asking, what would their long term relationship with Poland and
hmm
Germany be? Because I think the war is already kind of done in
hmm
Ukraine. Like, I think they have no mobility. We're being painted this false picture that Russia is just too inefficient to operate. I think that's a very false picture because everything that we're hearing comes from the Ukrainian side.
Yeah, yeah.
So what's happening is that the Ukrainian military is defeated. They cannot win in pitched battle. And in America, we have a mentality, Second Amendment mentality, and we would retreat to higher ground. We would retreat to more favorable terrain to mount an opposition or an insurgency. Red
Hmm.
Dawn, the movie,
Right.
was
Hmm.
basically that. In Ukraine, their mentality is let's retreat to high population dense centers to inflict massive casualties in a war, because urban warfare is universally undesirable. But it's not like Ukraine doesn't have forests and stuff like that from which to mount guerrilla warfare. Instead, they're
Hmm.
mounting last stand types of resistance in high density population centers.
Yeah.
And the Russians, they're hiding out in hospitals and all this other stuff, and the Russians are doing precision strikes. And we're
Hmm.
basically going to see the repeat of Aleppo, where the Russians will do precision strikes. They're not going to advance. They're just going to do precision strikes from the
Hmm.
air. And then when the time is right, they're going to capture mad swaths of a city.
Hmm.
That's what's going to happen in like 5 of these cities in Ukraine.
Right.
Ukrainians are done, and they should have probably taken the peace deal that was offered.
Yeah, I mean it seems as though there were. I think that they're being goaded by the United States and
Oh
the
yeah.
West. The leadership is, at least, they're having their egos inflated, and they're giving them this false hope that we're gonna be backing them up with full air cover and stuff like that, which I don't think that anyone who's sane in the United States really wants to happen, regardless of what they say. Alan, because you're really good at history, part of what I think is happening, because Ray's bringing up the fact that the Ukrainians are just, they're having a hard time figuring out how to fight this war. And Russia is also, it seems like, they're coming in and they're not immediately kicking into war machine mode the way that a lot of people expected. Is part of it just the fact that Europe had this long tradition of war, but they haven't had really serious ground wars for so many decades that in some ways it's kind of not like Syria or the Middle, because this is new, I think, to a lot of these. Even for Russia, they just haven't had this experience, of fighting this terrain on European cities.
Well, there is I think, a false notion that war should be made for TV and go really fast. I
Hmm.
think that's a false idea. Wars can take
Right.
a long time. They can take years. We're only, what, day 21 into this thing, and Russia's making fairly consistent gains
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
south. They are going very slow now, it looks like, because they are encountering the resistance in the cities, but everywhere else they're able to move almost where they want to. Now there is a cost, and we are increasing the Russian cost through arms shipments and everything else. But like Ray said earlier, a lot of this ends up getting people shelled and attacked in cities, because that's where the military in some instances are moving. So it makes it harder to prevent civilian casualties. And I think that's one of the things that baits public opinion in the West. You see a hospital bombed. Well, compare the reaction to that happening in Ukraine when Russia does it to what happened when, well, I believe it was the first Gulf War. Saddam would
Right.
say this was a hospital, and
Mhm.
people discounted it. They said, well, we got to verify that.
Mhm.
There's a willingness to believe anything bad that's said about Russia because they're the aggressor, and the media primes that. And
Right. Yeah.
the longer this goes, that the concern, I think, goes up that somehow, some way, something will be done that pulls the West in with an emotional instead of a rational response.
So you don't necessarily agree with what Ray said, that the war is done. You think that this might actually mushroom?
Ukraine's lost. No,
Yeah, yeah,
Ukraine's
that,
lost. The
yeah.
bulk of their forces are going to eventually be pincered in the east,
Hmm.
and they will
Yeah.
capture what they want. It's in that sense, yes. The question is, how long can Ukraine drag it out? And it could go for a long time, because you
Yeah.
can move from a standard fight to an insurgency
Hmm.
very quickly. And a lot of these weapons are shoulder launched, You can take take out a helicopter, take out a tank, and it doesn't take
Yeah.
much. You can do it all on foot. So that's when I think that, and my concern has been that if you really do care about innocent Ukrainian lives, at some point you have to get serious with the Ukrainian government and urge them to find a way to make a settlement that's good for them, but also good for their people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, okay. So turning to the United States and the long term effects of this on us, what what is behind the push to war? I mean, if you want to put your conspiracy theorist hats on, what could
Okay.
possibly be the benefit for the Democrats of wanting to goad us into a conflict like this, where the stakes are so high, and the risks are so high, and and the moral justification for it is just destined to not last longer than a couple months as people start looking into everything. What are they getting out of it, and why are they pushing it? What do you think? I'll go to Ray first.
Uh, Common enemy, supposedly. Like, if we
Yeah.
look at Trump's strategy, the only coherent strategy that Trump had in 2020 was to try to rally the country around China or against China, and that failed miserably. So this is the instance of the Democrats. They need an ally, or they need something to rally the country around, because they lost the narrative on COVID. So they needed that. The media, as far as their reporting on the Russia Ukraine thing, has been terrible since 2014. What they report as a revolution, was really a George Soros style color revolution. So I think this is more, they're doing the Great Reset agenda, and Zelensky is all in on the Great Reset. If you look at his 2020 speech to the World Economic Forum, the amount of times he drops the new normal in English, sort of quasi English, because it was translated speech because he wanted to do it in Ukrainian, even though he's a native Russian speaker, by the way. Fun fact about Zelensky. He, the amount of times he said new normal in a speech in January of 2020 was ominous, to say the least. And he's a puppet for the Great Reset. His ties to Ukrainian oligarchs, man, I'm trying to remember his name, Igor Komoisky, and then
Yeah.
as well as so that's Zelensky's agenda. He's a puppet of the World Economic Forum. And then the Democrats, likewise, what was Joe Biden's campaign slogan? Build Back Better. So I just think they're trying to follow the Great Reset agenda. And they're probably, in my opinion, if you look at what's going on with the US dollar, this thing's going to tank soon. So
Yeah.
that's what concerns me is, parent of two children and stuff like that. That concerns me is the U.S. dollar. All this stuff I have in savings, will that be around? So I think it has more to do with, destroying the U.S. dollar.
Yeah. Well, you can't build back better unless you have a chance to build, right? So you got to
And
break
I,
break
I think
everything.
I think that's something that you both have hit on there, and I'm going to put my Alex Jones tinfoil hat on here for
That's
good.
fine. That's fine.
1917 in Russia. It would not have happened without the ultimate disruption of society caused by the war. Stalin and Lenin both said it. It sped up the seeds of revolution in Russia. A war combined with a famine, combined with the economic dislocation caused by COVID, Weimar style inflation. I mean, if you want to destabilize and want to have a communist revolution, this is how you get it. You get the US into a war, unfavorable type of war, that's going to cost a lot of lives, and it's going to go on and on and on for years, along with famine and economic collapse. You sow the seeds of overturning everything. So if you want a conspiracy type theory, that's where I would look at. And it goes hand in hand with Great Reset and everything else, all the other bureaucratic power grabs. If we take, and we should be very skeptical of these people after what happened with COVID, I think we should be very skeptical about what reasons they have for it. And maybe they are just altruists. They want to spread democracy and
Right.
goodness and bring prosperity to Ukraine. I don't
Yeah.
know. I just don't
I
think so.
Well, my thing is, I just hope that when we get on the other side of this crisis, I never want to hear about the Ukraine for a couple of years. Like I feel like they've been dominating the news, for, the impeachment, all this other stuff.
Right.
Okay, so I just want to kind of talk about the churches a little bit, because obviously the evangelical population was a big part of the Trump movement, and I do feel like there was a moment when it seemed like we were getting momentum to actually take back some of the churches. But I just feel like in the last 3 weeks, what I'm hearing from everyone everywhere is the prayer groups are now all, using that prayer time to pray for the people of Ukraine, but at the same time, bring all that propaganda we're talking about into the church. And it's become, because of the fact there were so many missionaries in Ukraine, the Southern Baptist Convention, this, fun fact, they pulled all of the resources out of Central America because they said they wanted to send missionaries to places that had never heard the name of Jesus. And now we're finding out that a lot of those resources were allocated to Ukraine, which is a Christian, it's not like they had never heard the name of Jesus.
Right.
But because of that, I think it's becoming now very, very touchy in conservative evangelical circles to say any of the stuff that we've said on this program now. Do you think that that's do we have to basically just give up? All of the work. I know Ray has worked so hard, and Alan, you both, you've worked so hard to try to, regain some of the ground because we lost so much of the churches to the left. But is this basically, we can't recover it because the war has made our side so, taboo? What do you guys think?
I don't know how much momentum we had in the Southern Baptist Convention in the first place, but as far as Christian media goes, Christian Post is the worst offender, I think, on the issue of Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'll be doing a video or on that either tomorrow or Friday on how this dude just completely bastardizes Bible verses and applies it to Ukraine and Russia as though like something about being cut off from the mother being cut off from the children. Like, are you that verse doesn't apply. If anything, it's more like the Israelites running to Egypt to save them from Assyria or Babylon. Like that is a much more fitting comparison.
Yeah.
Well, I think I was gonna say, I think there is one thing. First of all, I want to say Ray had a very good article like about a few month ago, not a month ago, like 6 months ago, a year ago, about Willie Rice being a docent customer. And I think that shows the value of the type of non-establishment conservative media that's out there. Because I think going into the election in the Southern Baptist Convention, I think Rice is a bad candidate.
I think he's going to be James Merritt 2.0.
Well, I think he's going to have a hard time winning election because I just don't think he's a very likable, unlike Ed Litton, for all his flaws, he has kind of an aw shucks quality that you can take a look at him. He looked kind of like a grandfatherly figure. Rice I don't sense any of that electricity for him. He'll get the woke support, sure, but I do think that there might be a slight chance to pull an upset in Anaheim for the simple reason there are just so many inconsistencies with Rice and the candidacy and things. And I don't think that the war and the narrative change and COVID is going to really stop people who are angry from trying to make an effective change. So that's the one thing that gives me hope. I just don't think they're going to care.
Well, one of the reasons I'm asking is because First Baptist Dallas was seen as a possible stronghold. People look at that as a beacon, and
Robert Jeffress's church.
Yes, and it seems as though Robert Jeffers has now completely he bought into the COVID ideology, and now he's completely touting the family line, and I think a lot of the prayer leaders and the leadership of the church is doing the same thing, and it's kind of like you can't walk into an environment like that and say the kind of things that we've been saying. So it just,
it's interesting. I was at a Republican fundraiser last night because I'm a candidate running for local office. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, congratulations! What are you running for? City council?
County commissioner.
Oh, okay. In Virginia?
Maryland.
Okay, all right.
So I was at an event and it was the lieutenant governor candidate for the candidate that Trump endorsed, Dan Cox. So his lieutenant governor candidate, she was born in Yugoslavia, and she came out her opening part of her speech was about condemning NATO for bombing Yugoslavia.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So, yeah,
she came out based.
Yeah,
in a very Republican environment.
Yeah.
So it makes me think there's a lot more people awake.
Yeah.
There's a lot more people awake, and I don't think we're falling for it. The problem is the organization. That is the major question. I think we have a grassroots. There is a grassroots, but is the grassroots organized on a local level, on an ecclesiastical level? Because I don't think the Conservative Baptist Network has done a good job thus far. I think in 2021 they did not bring the fight. Their messaging on the issue that they were fighting was terrible. They didn't make it seem as existential as it was. And in 2022, their messaging is basically tokenism.
Well, are they really running Vody Bakum, or is that
no? He's already declined the nomination.
Okay, all right.
He thinks he's ineligible.
Yeah,
and he believes he cannot faithfully call himself a Southern Baptist, so that's a non-issue. But I think they're going to run Lee Brand. If I had to make a bet, they would probably run Lee Brand. And I don't. They don't have a winning strategy. And their conference, by the way, they're doing a conference that has Robert Jeffress as a speaker. So
yeah, see, that's the thing, and it's like they're still going to be they're going to be sliding a little bit into Fox News land. I mean, possibly. The other thing is, I felt like with the Conservative Baptist Network, we have to look at the Southern Baptist Convention as a political entity similar to Ukraine, where people are jockeying back and forth for power. And so, you have someone like J.D. Greer who cancels elections in 2020, and they should not have let that go. They should have pounded that again and again and again, and they should have thrown into doubt everything that J.D. Greer did for that extra year, because the constitutional argument for it, I think, was not strong. And then they were saying, well, we did this during World War II. And I'm like, why don't you bring up the fact that was during a time that was like the Jim Crow era, practically, like that they were going back to, of when the last time someone had canceled it for a year. But I think that fights like that, if we were serious about taking that back, we're dealing with a Soros color revolution, in these entities, in these organizations, in these types of structures. And you have to fight it that way, but I don't know if we have that in us,
I do think that you guys said something right. The messaging was kind of off in 2021. It wasn't presented as an existential threat, and I was told the reasons for that. You have to run a specific style of campaign to get the Baptist preachers to vote for you. You can't say, this guy's teaches heresy, and they'll get angry. So that's one of the things I was told, and I assume they know how to win Baptist elections better than I do. However, I do think you need a certain level of grassroots support. And when I thought the one really bad messaging element in that campaign was when Baptist Press had the interview with Mike Stone, and Mike Stone basically said, we're all three conservatives in this race. I just think that was not presenting the facts. No, you're not all conservatives. Al Mohler has done more to destroy the Southern Baptist Convention than anyone. I mean, he's responsible for Russell Moore and Kevin Ezell and Adam Greenway. You just go down the list. Every entity head, basically. And then you've got Ed Litton, where everybody was warning Ed Litton's woke. He's the wokest candidate in the race. So I think sometimes conservatives, it's in their nature. We're going to be nice guys. We're just going to, not, be mean. And that certainly, I think, bit them when it came time to get the vote there because they had not made the case strong enough. That Stone was the only conservative in the race. The other two guys shouldn't have been a possibility. And
you're
now
referring to Randy
Anaheim.
Adams as not a serious candidate, or
Well, I thought Randy Adams would get. Actually, I thought Randy Adams would probably get some more votes last time. I thought he ran a really good campaign pointing out the flaws in the Southern Baptist Convention, the corruption, and he took heat for it. But let's be honest; these are not very good people. They're A lot of the people are motivated by money and are running things in a very inefficient way. And I think Randy Adams' campaign was was refreshing the hard line he took for reform.
Yeah. Well, I just hope that what doesn't happen, which I fear will happen, is that, if the country's in this wartime propaganda mode, you know, that the small camp that we have will get split up even more because there's a certain number of people who agree with us on everything, but on something like this, they would look at what we're doing as being pro-Putin. Um, and they would side with, the woke people who would also throw that charge at us, which then now that they've masterfully woven that together with being white nationalists, which is crazy, given the context of Russia and the Ukraine. But, all of that kind of goes together, and they're going to get this influx of all of this counterintelligence money from the U.S. government, because the U.S. government has all these programs to try to fight white nationalism in churches domestically. So, I guess I am worried about that, or not worried, but I wonder if, like, for our energies, we just might have to just give up on the fight about evangelicalism. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. What would it take for you to just give up? Because both of you are so productive,
Well, I'll say this about the fight for evangelicalism. It's so funny because last year in
Yeah.
May, just prior to the convention, start of May, I'm like, I'm retiring from this. I've got a lot better things to do.
Yeah.
This election is going to be it because it's this future of the Southern Baptist Convention will be determined by that election. It's
Yeah.
either going to be put on a course toward being saved or gone away. I mean,
Yeah.
I was telling everybody that entire month,
Yeah.
and my wife looked at me funny and said, "Okay," and
Yeah.
I'll believe it when I see it. But I was serious. I can pursue other things. But then the Ed Litton
Yeah.
situation
And you know what?
happened,
And
and it was like,
you guys have to take credit. It was the bloggers who brought him down. It really was.
well,
It was the bloggers who brought him down. I mean, I was
well,
stunned when he said he wasn't going to run.
and then we
it,
got the mainstream media to cover that.
I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Sermon-gate made the front page of the New York Times. And it's stunning that he
Yeah.
survived. He didn't retire. He didn't, or not retire, resign.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that shows you something about Litton and his backers. This is just how
Yeah.
corrupt they are. They
Mm-hmm.
pretend to be holding the Christian values to all of these things, but the reality is they just want power and everything that comes with it, and they'll do anything to cling to it. I mean, Bart Barber, the trustee and all that, he made that video that said, I'm against plagiarism, but I don't want Litton to resign because that will give the
Yeah.
Conservative
Yeah.
Baptist Network power. I'm like, that's
Yeah.
the ethics of people in the pulpit of the Southern Baptist Convention. It's not. I mean, it's not even ethics that are worthy of liberal politicians. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
mind-boggling that these are people that claim to be Christian, and that's why the church is in the situation it's in. And anyway, but what will it take me to give up? At some point, you have to say the denominations are not salvageable. When that is, I don't know. I think we'll all have a sense and feeling for it. It may be too late
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Well, I think Anaheim, I don't know what you think is going to happen, Ray, in Anaheim. I mean, I'm so checked out of it all. I've been in hiding for 8 months or whatever. I just came back because the Russia Ukraine stuff. I just felt like I wanted to be able to be involved in the discourse again. But I mean, Ray, do you is there anything left that we can hang on to, or is it just like, let's finally, we've been talking about it for so long, let's finally let the whole thing burn?
I mean, I was gonna live stream the convention anyway, just thinking how bad and ridiculous it would be. But there could be a show here.
Yeah.
There could be a fight, a Hail Mary pass, and it would be a Hail Mary last play of the game. And I don't know. And again, the Conservative Baptist Network seems to be the biggest organization that could get in the way of this.
Mm-hmm.
But when you got JD Hall saying if Tom Buck runs, I will get 1,000 messengers to show up.
Mm-hmm.
That's a game changer.
Yeah, if they can get there. Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what kind of tricks they play. I mean, I'm ready for them to have like suddenly road construction blocking the garage. I mean, they're going to pull out stuff like this because I know the SBC.
They snap up a lot of hotels. That was the thing last year in Nashville. They were talking about because of the a lot of it was hard to get hotels.
Yeah,
and there were a lot of people telling that story. They had to get them very far away because all the ones were booked up almost immediately. So probably you could expect something like that type of stuff. Although it's big cities, it's going to be really hard to do too much.
Have your cell phone.
I keep wondering about COVID.
Well,
I keep wondering about we're going to have another lockdown out there in California, because California is a horrible place to be holding a convention.
Yeah.
I mean, I know they're trying to get rid of this stuff, but I'm going to be very skeptical about that.
I would say have your cell phones ready to film, because they're going to have an army of these female saboteurs that are going to just remember what they did with Hannah and Mike Stone. Like they're going to try everything, and that's what they're going to. I think that's what they're going to go to, because they have. I think that our opponents in the evangelical world have figured out that that's our Achilles heel. That if they throw sex at us, we don't know what to do.
Or internalized feminism is our Achilles heel. We've internalized too much feminist ideology, and we don't even know to what degree we've done this, because that's how much internalized it is. And I know that sounds like weird, but when I did a live stream like a few weeks ago about how like all of feminism was bad, like from the beginning, like Susan B. Anthony should not be a celebrated figure in Republican politics, yet she is. And it's like, because all that they pushed was really bad at the time.
Right.
So
I feel like internalized feminism explains a lot of how the Biden administration is trying to manage everything in the Ukraine. I feel like it's like the Mean Girls tactic. Okay, we'll just get everyone to not talk to Russia, you know what I mean? And we'll take away your credit cards. And I mean, it's just kind of like this bitchy, like underhanded way of doing, and it's like, I don't know.
That's how the SBC entities are run. It's kind of that same type of thing. It's like, we're not going to talk to you, because you go sit at the other table. If you're me, you got the wrong tone.
Yeah, that's exactly how what I've been thinking as I'm watching the whole thing unfold between Russia and Ukraine. I feel like the Southern Baptist Convention has now become writ large. Like all of our political battles are like the EU, and NATO now. It'll be interesting. So Ray, do you think what do you guys? I'll leave you guys with this final. I'll give you the floor to both of you for doomsday scenarios. What's the most likely doomsday scenario that you think will come out of the current events we're living through? How bad do you think it can get plausibly?
I mean, I don't know what happens if the US dollar crashes. So I don't know what happens then.
$9 a gallon gas and like bread lines, rationing, riots, like.
I mean, it's interesting because, again, the demographic divide is Democrats are in cities, Republicans are in the countryside. Mm-hmm. So if you see that kind of divide, that'll make a civil war very interesting. Sort of like, ironically, we would be like the Maoist in the Chinese Civil War, because they just swept the countryside.
Right.
Whereas the nationalist of China stayed in the cities.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe could see something like that. I don't think we're going to see nuclear war. It would also, because nations have missiles, but nations also have anti-missile technology. So I don't know how that'll work, because that's never really been tested on each other. That's never been tested live before.
I think Europe is way too wimpy. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't think you don't have a large number of men in Europe anymore who are
right.
going to be willing to put on a uniform. So I think the conflict is going to play out through something other than conventional warfare. They're going to go to the more feminine arts of,
I mean, that's why they're
open,
waging a propaganda campaign. They're retreating to the cities
yeah,
so they can have a massive civilian casualty rate, so they can post it on the news so foreigners can come and bail them out. That is the
yeah,
Ukrainian strategy at this point.
yeah, which is so destructive. And I guess what the economic crash here could then lead to just massive unrest. It would be like the Spanish Civil War. It was the same thing, where the conservatives had the countryside and the socialists had the cities. The socialists actually had the gold, but that didn't make a difference because they couldn't use it because they were surrounded. And then the Cuba was like that too. Castro came from the country. The last place he took was Havana.
So it's good to be in the country.
It is. It is. Okay. Well, that doesn't help me as much as it helps you guys, but I live in the city. But all right. So, Alan, what do you think? What's the most plausible doomsday scenario?
Quick, and I got to jump off, but the most plausible I do think is the tightening of a Sino-Russian bloc with its sanctions pushing Russia and everyone to start finding alternatives to the dollar.
Yeah.
I think that's the real problem here, and I think that's where we're headed. And the collapse of the petrodollar, as Ray pointed out, who knows what happens next? And I think that's the big fear because we need to be pushing Russia and China apart instead of pulling them together. So I think that's where we are right now,
That's what a
and
competent
hopefully
foreign
that.
policy would do.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
competent foreign policy would drive a wedge between those nations.
Yeah.
Yes, and because they are in Asia and they are going to have interest. I mean,
Mhm.
it goes dating back to Imperial Russia. That was the thing. So that's where we are, and we're making amateur policy mistakes. So that's what we
Mhm.
kind of got to rectify. But I got to jump off here. It
All
was
right.
good talking
Thank
to you guys.
Yeah.
thank you
Thanks for
very
having
much.
me.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Alan. I
Keep up the good
appreciate
work,
it.
guys.
I appreciate it.
All
Yeah.
right, bye.
God bless. So, Ray, it's like, thank you for joining us. I had a really good talk with Alan about this. And, I've been following your thoughts on it. I think you have a little bit of a different take on it than Alan. So I'd love to hear. So you're looking at this Ukraine war. Um, Tell me more about what you were saying about how you think that Zelensky is like a puppet of the New World Order, and that who's ultimately putting him up to this?
Uh, the most immediate connection would be Igor Kolomoisky,
Yeah,
who's a Ukrainian oligarch. I believe he's like wanted in many countries.
yeah,
So he would have been the one because he definitely had it was his network, I believe, that Zelensky's TV show was aired on. It was also it is alleged that he also financed Zelensky's production company. So
right.
he would be the most direct connection. Allegedly, George Soros is tied to that guy as well.
Hmm.
Zelensky is a member in good standing of World Economic Forum.
Yeah,
So I believe his cross-dressing music video was done in UK. So very Western educated type of guy in Zelensky as well. So
yeah.
that's
Did you see his address to Congress? I thought it was so weird that he didn't even put on a tie. He was in like this
no, I didn't
tight.
see that, but I think I saw like the images of like the Nazi ideology he was wearing or something like
It
that.
was, and he's wearing like this, like the shirt was too small for. He was trying to look like Joe Rogan, I think, or Dan Bongino with like the tight T-shirt. And it was weird. It was so bizarre. I was like,
I mean, what was also bizarre is that the current Minks, I guess they're trying to negotiate a
yeah,
peace deal, and
yeah,
like the Ukrainian delegation is like dressed like bums, whereas the
yeah,
Russians are in like suits and stuff. So it's like, I don't know how seriously they're even taking this.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot there that we just don't know. I mean, because it's a part of the world that's run by warlords and mafia
But they dress
kingpins.
nice still.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Some of them do. Some of them do. I just, I think that it is going to be so hard to predict what the fallout is going to be in Western Europe. Um, uh, depending on how much of an upheaval this causes, I mean, we did see when the British voted to leave the European Union. So this could lead to a renaissance of nationalist parties in Europe that might vote out the New World Order. I mean, that might be the silver lining of it.
I
And I
mean,
don't.
anything that destabilizes the EU is good for in my book.
Yeah, that was the thing is, because I don't know if you know about, I when I went to Europe, I was did a lot of work there when I was being asked to defend traditional marriage, and because of that, I was uh, accused of being a pro-Russian human rights violator by the Human Rights Campaign. In this big report, they sent out a picture of my face. They tried to tie me to, and I had never been to Russia, so that's the only reason why these places have been on my radar all these years. But I don't think in Europe, the EU is absolutely, it's perverted. It's run by perverts, and they're obsessed with sex. They're obsessed with and I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it. They're obsessed with bringing really weird sexual thinking. They want to remake all of the languages of Europe, from Welsh to Basque to Finnish, all of them. They want to be made gender neutral, and it's almost impossible because English is the only language that is gender neutral. But they're trying to impose that on there. The EU is terrible, and NATO is basically the EU with guns. So it's the same ideology. But I think if that class of people that has been, that's based in Brussels, that has been imposing all of this on them, I think that they could be vulnerable, depending on the fallout from this war. I was talking to my friends in England, who he's got a very very, very grim sense of what the future is going to bring. So they're actually trying to sell their house in London, because he just thinks it's going to be really bad there. They import all their food. So these embargoes are going to, because I don't know if you agree with this, but it seems as though the food prices, we're not seeing the big spike yet. It's going to be a couple months down the pipeline as the
It's a little gradual at the moment.
Yeah. Have you seen it at your supermarket? The food.
I mean, I use Instacart a lot because I'm too lazy to go to stores and stuff like that. But no,
Really?
I have kids and I work telework and stuff, so I don't want to be that parent with the kids in the grocery store. But anyway, so I use Instacart, and you still notice the price increases and like the shortages and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's all electronic, but you see it.
Yeah, there's just like basic things like
Cream cheese.
Stuff that went from like 70 cents to 75 cents over 2 days. You know what I mean? And then you'll come back the next day and like the can of whatever corn or whatever will be 81 cents. I mean, it's just everything is going up. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in Europe, because if there is a revival of those nationalist parties, I mean, it'll be interesting. I mean, I think a lot of the European countries, they're given to extremes. So they'll go from one extreme, this far left extreme that they're in right now, to then, that's how Nazi Germany happened. You go from one extreme to the other. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
If you think about it, one of the things that's true is like the bad guys won in World War One.
Mm-hmm.
Lenin being pretty much a proxy of the Germans.
Yeah.
He came out on top. The French came out on top. The British, they were the bad guys in World War One as well. Mm-hmm. They came out on top, and Woodrow Wilson, I guess, looked good to himself. He was a villain in American history.
Yeah.
So the bad guys won. If Germany had won World War One, you wouldn't have had World War II play out the way that it did, and you would have had more stabilized Europe, I would say. But instead, you created countries that never really held up their own in that era of European politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then you set up Russia to be communist. And that wasn't, once Stalin came to power, World War II was inevitable, not because of Hitler, but because of Stalin. He was going to invade Eastern Europe.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting too, because I read a couple different biographies of Lenin 2 years ago. I was just interested in this. I was reading up on that. And one of the things they were saying about the communist revolution was that at the beginning, there was a strong conservative contingent that didn't want communists, but the conservative leaders were telling them that they were going to go back to the days of the Tsar, which meant that a lot of those people were going to have to become like basically serfs again. And that was what this author is basically suggests that that's why it failed, because the conservative alternative was so unattractive. And I see so many parallels to the right wing in Europe and America today, where they, we can see how terrible the woke world is. I think everyone right now is throwing up over the trans stuff. But sometimes what the conservatives are suggesting is something that's so unrealistic and so antiquated that it's not a real alternative,
I just think it has more to do with the fact that our politicians don't actually offer real solutions.
Yeah.
What is the Republican Party good for? Tax cuts for the people that don't vote for us?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
support
Yeah.
our causes? Like, you're supposed to use politics to help your people.
Yeah, and they don't. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. How's everything else going with life? You have the 2 kids. Isn't one of them a babe? Last time I talked to you, like I think
6 months old now.
So, oh my gosh, it's been that long since I've talked to you.
I think it has.
Yeah. Your hair is different now. It's like,
yep.
Yeah, you kind of. So that's going well. Your wife is good.
Yep. Very good.
That's good. That's good. All right. Well, I'm going to keep in touch. Drop me a line when you come up with articles that are really good. I'm kind of like just still trying to hide out for a while to just get my life situated. But I'd love to be able to keep abreast of the stuff that you're covering.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I got an RSS feed and you can follow that. And then, evangelicaldarkweb.org is the place to go for the audience.
Yeah. So you're still up and at it, like watching what's going on in the evangelical world. What do you make of this Julie Roy's John MacArthur thing?
I mean, she hates John MacArthur with a passion.
Yeah.
So you got to take that into account. She is a Karen. Like the way she went after like Liberty University for a snowball fight, because that snowball fight violated Virginia mandates. Like she went after Liberty University for that. And
she went after at one point because Jerry Falwell Jr. liked an Instagram picture of a female Liberty student who was wearing, I guess, tight.
I mean, that was unwise on his part, but it's not like cancel worthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like an article worthy. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
she really hates John MacArthur. She did the hit piece on his wealth, all while saying "You go, girl" to Beth Moore when she left the convention, because Beth Moore, I believe, has more money than John MacArthher.
Yeah,
I could be wrong about that.
Yeah,
but, she was "You go, girl" to rich feminist, and then down with the patriarchy to John MacArthur, who mostly claims the wealth are long standing because of California real estate. Right. And he got a watch as a gift for like 50 years of service. They paid $500 or $5,000 for something like that. $100 for each year, I guess.
Yeah.
So it doesn't sound as bad as it was. So they got him onto fancy watches, I guess he dresses well. Nothing wrong with that. But otherwise, the question is, what does he do with his wealth? Not the fact that he has it.
Yeah. Well, it's just
just bad journalism. And then this one is like you're digging up something way from the past that he's vaguely connected to. It's not like his church was perfect in this instance, but they were operating with the information that they had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, just are they still? Is this like still one of the things that they bring up a lot as abuse cases and whether church leaders intervened? I mean, because it just seemed like that was such the obsessive topic of discussion for 4 years. I thought that they would have moved on from this because
I mean, in the Southern Baptist Convention, it is so rampant, the covering up of sexual abuses by churches and by the national institution, that the first major payout, the first major announcement findings of this sexual abuse task force in the Southern Baptist Convention is to pay a woman who was 26 at the time, who had a 12-year sexual relationship with a seminary professor or a college professor, as most people would see that.
Oh, that's the first payout they made?
Oh, that's like the first big findings. They gave an apology for that. It's like, man, what was her name?
And the weird thing was that she was an executive at Lifeway when the Lifeway employee molested his daughter, that Hannah, right? And
I don't
so
know if she was a Lifeway employee. He was a Lifeway employee, but
yeah,
maybe he
yeah.
was.
He was a Lifeway employee and he was attending Southern. So all of the people that, Hannah, I mean, first of all, your father is I mean, it's tragic what happened, but her father is the one who molested her. So all these other people that she's trying to drag into the net of accountability, all of the ones who had any remote connection to her case, she was protecting, and she was going after the people who had like Mike
The
Stone,
periphery, like
yeah,
at most Al Mueller, maybe
yeah,
of
yeah,
Southern.
yeah. But she was protecting him. He came out of that. So I can't believe they're still talking about that. But sex. I mean, they have been talking about that for 4 or 5 years. It's
They're
like,
going to publish their findings at the convention. I would
mhm.
imagine like that's what's going to be reported. But so far, like that is the major finding was that, since they waived the attorney-client privilege, the first major breakthrough of that investigation was you know, the adulterous woman. They just paid her. And they didn't, and the Southern Baptist Convention did mishandle that instance of sexual misconduct because they should have fired her.
Yeah.
I would have
Wow.
fired her so
Right.
hard when you fire him too, obviously,
Right.
but she doesn't get to keep her job. If two
Mhm.
church staffers are having an extramarital affair with each other, you fire both of
Yeah.
them.
Well, I think it's just this has been the women that are in the Southern Baptist orbit are going to be women. I mean, I hate to be so blunt, but I don't care because I'm just not part of the church discussion world anymore. Also, I'll just say it. These are women who would not be able to survive in the secular job market competing against real competent women. These are kind of like mediocre uh, women who are congregating in the Southern Baptist world, and so that is their leverage of power. It seems to me that's what they can bring up is playing the victim and then calling for men to come and save them and making men feel bad because they didn't protect them. I mean, that's kind of what I think is the trend going on there.
Or they're just being pawns for men
Yeah.
to men on the other side to use.
Yeah. 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 Well, all right. Well, I'm gonna keep in current on the stuff that you're doing, and I'll drop you a line once in a while to say hello,
Yeah,
Ray. Give my regards
definitely.
to all the rest of the gang out there. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.